As package authors in Sublime Text, we know that we can create our own custom commands in our plugins. Those commands allow us to define actions that the user can take, and in order to improve the facility of our commands, we can give them arguments to control what it is they do at any given time. Now, sometimes you want those arguments to be set by the user when they're pressing a key or choosing a menu item, but sometimes you want to be able to prompt the user for the values of arguments so that they can tailor what the command is going to do to the exact situation in which they are running it. In our previous lesson, we covered the basics of input handlers, which allow you to do that very thing. In today's lesson, we're going to dive into input handlers in a little bit more detail to see exactly what we can do under the hood of this powerful mechanism in Sublime Text packages. Hey, hello, fellas Sublime Text fanatics. Odan Nerd here. Welcome back to Plugin 101, the video course teaching you how to become a package and plugin author in Sublime Text. Now, the topic of this week's lesson is a continuation of the last lesson where we were talking about input handler basics. Here we're going to go more in depth into input handlers and what they can actually do because we really only scratched the surface in that introduction. I didn't want to get too in depth into all of the methods that are available in the classes that define input handlers without first explaining how you set one up and what they're actually for. So if you haven't watched that lesson and you're not familiar with input handlers in general, then you might want to pause this video, jump on back there and watch that one, and then come back here and this will make a lot more sense. Of course, you can always go back and watch that one if you watch this one and it doesn't make sense, and then watch this one again. That video is linked down in the description of the video, and so is the Plugin 101 playlist that covers all of the lessons in this video series, including the lessons on commands if you're a little bit unfamiliar on how you define commands in a plugin as well. So as a very quick recap of what we learned in last week's lesson, if we were to define a command, we could provide arguments to that command. And if you execute a command and you don't give it all of the arguments, then the command can't run. You see an error down in the console because much like in any programming language, if you define a subroutine or a function or a method or whatever terminology, and it takes arguments and you don't provide them, normally that causes a problem. And commands are no different. Now, while you can set arguments to commands in key bindings, menu entries, key palette entries, or when you're executing a command via a plugin, there are cases where you want to actually prompt the user for what the values of those arguments could be, because it may be something that you can't know in advance. And a way to do that is by using an input handler, and this works by a very specific mechanism. First and most important, we mentioned it twice in the previous video. We'll probably mention it more than once in this video. Commands that want to use input handlers must exist in the command palette. And you do that by creating a Sublime Commands file with an entry for your command. The name doesn't matter as long as the extension is correct and that it is a correct file and is inside of a package. And this will give your command a caption to be known as inside of the command palette, the command to execute, and any arguments you'd like to give it. If you don't provide a command arguments, it would, as I said, generate an error. But in the specific case of commands that are in the command palette, before Sublime generates the error, it'll call the input method in your command to ask it, hey, you don't have all of your arguments. Do you know how to gather them? There's a default implementation for this, which says no, which is why most commands generate the error. You, however, can go ahead and implement how it could gather the arguments by way of input handlers. And there's two different ways we can do this. We can create a text input handler to grab a string of text, and we can use a list input handler to provide a list of items. And the sample plugin we have here is a modification of the one we used in the previous lesson, but with much more stuff in it. We create input handlers the same way we create commands by declaring a class that is a subclass of one of the known types of input handlers or commands if you're creating a command. And then there are various methods inside of that class that Sublime knows about that it will call to interface with you. Now, in the case of a command, that's things like run to run the command, input to see if you can gather your arguments, input description, which is how your command appears in the command palette, which is we're going to see in just one moment. whether your command is enabled or not, whether it's visible in the menu or not, what its caption is if it's in a menu, all of that sort of stuff. Input handlers have the exact same list of arguments, not the exact same arguments per se, but the exact same concept that there are argument or methods inside that class rather that tell it Sublime how to interface with your class. But by the same token, you can also implement any other methods apart from those if you need to. So let's go through these methods one by one. The first method we're going to cover is the name method, which Sublime will call in order to determine what argument to the command this instance of the input handler actually refers to. Now, the previous lesson we covered that this is actually inferred from the name of the class in the same way that the name of a command is inferred from the name of the class. It converts the class name to a snake case version of it and then throws away the underscore input underscore handler part. That's where the name comes from. Actually, the default implementation of the name method does that manipulation. It takes the name of the class, does the case conversions and the underscore conversions and the throwing away to come up with the value. So the default value for this depends on the name of the class that it's inside of, and here the default is set to what this method would have actually done. Now, why would you want to implement something like this? There's a couple of reasons. One, you might not want to name this class in a way that Sublime could infer it itself if you had a weird argument name or a name that's hard to represent in the name of a readable class. And also, it's possible to use the same input handler for multiple arguments if the only thing that is different is the name of the argument, but the other handling remains more or less the same. And remember, these are just standard classes. You could include an init method in here to provide any information you want. And just to sort of clarify how this all works, if we were to look down here at the command, the input method says, if message isn't in the list of arguments, then use a message input handler. Or if the position isn't in the list of arguments, use a position input handler. All this is doing is creating an instance of this class and returning it back, or it returns none if both of those items are already in the list, indicating that there are no further arguments that are needed. So the actual connection between this object instance that's returned and the name of the argument is in fact the name method here. After Sublime, gets the input from the user, it uses this name method to figure out what the argument name should be when the command is called again after you've selected all of the items. So you can use this to override that if you'd like to. The default is to get it from the name of the class. The initial text method specifies the text that appears inside of the text input widget of a text input handler, which could be an empty string, which is what the default is, or you could provide your own custom string here if there's a default that you'd like to use, or maybe you remember what the user chose last time and you're popping it up again to make choosing the same command again and slightly varying it a little bit easier. So here that's set to hello world, and when we choose it, it says hello world right there, but we're free to change this text with impunity, for example. And I can't spell this late at night, so we're just going to go ahead and gloss over that one. The next item here is placeholder. This specifies when there's no text here, this message that appears in a grayed out sort of version in this particular theme. How this displays depends on the theme that you're actually using, which gives you an indication of what this argument is actually for, which makes your life a little bit easier because this just says example. We don't necessarily know what it is we're actually trying to type here, but oh yeah, we're supposed to type the message to insert, like hi, for example. That's easy to type. This is something that you might see all over the place in forms on web pages, applications, and the like. So you have the ability to do that. The default is to not have any sort of placeholder. The description method is used to set what text is used to mark your argument in the command list of arguments there when it has been selected. Now, again, in order to demonstrate this, let's just point out that down here, example command has an input method or input description rather, that returns example. The item in the command palette says a sample command. So when I choose this, it says a sample command, but when I actually pick it, it says example because of input description. And you would do this because captions in the input and the command palette often have the name of the package prefixing the name of the command to make it easier to filter down to the exact command that you want. But you perhaps don't want to have a big, long, complicated command name in here when you're gathering arguments, so you can use input description to override it. In the exact same way, the description method here does that for the text that's actually as it has entered. So here, this is the text hello world. When I push enter, it's asking me for the next argument, and what we see there is a little placeholder bubble with the text message because the description method returned that string. The description method gets the text that was actually entered by the user. The default is to just return that text, so normally you would see hello world. So you could use this if you have multiple arguments and you don't want to take up a lot of space in the command palette to compress them down. You probably wouldn't do it in a method such as this. You might use a shorter version of it with ellipses or something along those lines. The next method is the preview method, which gets the text that's currently entered inside of the text field, and it allows us to populate the preview area, which is something we've been seeing all this time and didn't see in the previous example. So it is saying right now, inserting hello world. Anytime the text changes, like so, the preview method is recalled with the new text, allowing you to set the preview. Now, there's two things we can return here. We can return a string, which is what's happening right now, and the string is populated into the preview. Or optionally, if we wanted to, we could use sublime.html like so to generate some HTML inline. Actually, it's mini HTML, not full HTML. That's a subset of HTML that Sublime understands for the purposes of rendering things like this preview area, pop-ups, things of that nature. We haven't covered that in the lesson yet, but it's going to be happening in an upcoming lesson at some point in the future. So use those buttons down below to subscribe and ring the bell notification icon if you'd like to know when we're talking about mini HTML. But in this particular example, we're using bold on the text inserting and italics on the text being actually inserted, and we can see that style here. You could also do things like display colors in here if you like, and so on. The preview area has a predefined maximum size, but it's a pretty generous size for generating what this is probably trying to do. This validate method will be called with the text the user entered when they press enter. And this is your ability to examine that text and say, yes, I like this value, or no, I don't. The default is to always return true, which would specify to the Sublime that this input handler is now finished. You could return false here if you wanted to, if you determine that the text the user entered isn't valid, if it doesn't appear to be a valid option, perhaps based on other arguments that have been prompted in other input handlers, things of that nature. So in this particular example, if the text is hello, validate returns false. So this text works, and I can continue on here, but just the text hello, exactly the text hello, does not. I'm not allowed to commit this one because it does not validate. I have to mark it up a little bit more, and then we will be good to go. The next two items here, cancel and confirm, are used to tell you, unsurprisingly, when the input for this particular item has been canceled or has been confirmed. Here, canceled means the user pressed escape to close the command palette completely, or they backspaced over the value that they have previously provided in order to go back to a previous one. And confirm is used after validate is called to confirm that this is the actual text that has been selected if you'd like to do something or take some action based on that. For example, this is just a regular class. You could create an init method here and put whatever you want in that init method. Maybe you need to do some sort of cleanup of some sort. You could do that in cancel or in confirm, so that whichever way that goes, you're good to go. And these versions here are just printing to the console, and we can see those values appearing here. So if I was to backspace over this, out of the command completely, it says it's canceled. And if I choose the command again, choose that text, we see the message that we get when it's confirmed. And then when I backspace over it, it is canceled out like so. So that's those values there. And lastly in this list is next input, which, much like input in a command class, will be called after confirm is done with this one to ask you, Where do we go from here? Do we need to prompt for more input? This gets the argument dictionary so that you can determine if you need to use more input handlers in the same way that the input method in the command does. So in this particular one, we have it saying if position's not in the list of arguments, then return a position input handler instance to do something with. This has to return a valid instance of one of these classes, or the value none, which means we're good. Let's just continue. At that point, Sublime would try to re-execute the command with the arguments that it's gathered. Now, there's actually one other thing that we can return here that's sort of a built-in thing, but we're going to cover that in just a moment as we move on to the position input handler, which is a list input handler, the other type of input handler that we can provide, which displays a list of items instead of allowing the user to enter a string of arbitrary text. And what we're going to see here is that all of these methods, save one, are the also appear in the other class, and they are just as optional here as they are in that previous class. For example, up here in this class, the name has a default value, initial text is empty, placeholder is nothing, description nothing. If you don't need any of this functionality, if there was only one argument to your command that was a string and you didn't need to provide a preview or validate it or have a placeholder, it would be enough to create a class with an appropriate name with no body, and that whole input handler would work completely. Here, the list input handler is the same, except that you must provide list items because it needs to know what list of items that it's going to display. So let's just whip through this very quickly. Name here is the same as in the other class. It's used to specify the name of the argument that this input handler represents. It's default value comes from the name of the class. So for completeness sake here, I've set it to the name position, but you wouldn't need to do that unless you wanted to reuse this class. Similarly, if we drop down here, initial text is the text that would appear inside of the list input box for that argument. So here, it's just an empty string as we see here. So we're seeing the placeholder, which is one of the other values. The next one, the placeholder value here, which defaults to nothing, but I've set it to something to remind you what this value should actually be. If you were to set the initial text to some sort of initial text, as we see here, then that text would be pre-populated into the filter. So if there's a lot of items and you automatically know based on other arguments or some other information that some subset of those options is probably the one you want, you can pre-filter for the user. And of course, they can keep that and select from items or erase it and enter their own as they see fit. As we just saw, let's go ahead and swap that back. The placeholder specifies the placeholder text in there to give you an indication of what the argument you're selecting is actually for. The description method here does the exact same thing as it does in the other one. The default, this gets called with the value that would be inserted and the text. More on that in just a second. The default is to just use the text, so whatever option was chosen, you'd see it in there. But if you have a lot of arguments or some of the options are just really long, you might want to use a description to cut it down. Here I just clipped it to the string position to specify that. Preview does the exact same thing here. This can return a string or HTML. Here, this one's just returning a string, and it's using the value that it gets, which is the value that would be used for this argument. Again, more on that in just a moment, in its preview, so we could see what these things would actually do if we chose them. And continuing on downward again, if we went here, the validate method used to determine if a method, the selection is valid or not. The default is to always return true. Here, the code is saying if the value is 50, return false. So if we were to choose the one with a value of 50, which is middle of the file, I can't choose that one, but I could choose one of these other ones up here if I so chose. The cancel and confirm do the exact same things here as they did before, and we can see that there are messages down here that say canceled position input handler and things of that nature. We don't see any that's triggered that said position because I haven't actually run the command because it would modify this actual buffer, but I think we can infer what that would actually do. Let's gloss over next input for just one moment to come up here to the main thing that you're probably interested in if you're working with the list input handler, which is this list items thing here. And this is the only method you actually have to implement in this class because as a input handler that provides a list of items for you to choose from, you have to provide the list. Now, there's a couple of different ways that we can do this. Option one is to return just a list of strings. And when you do this, the list items that you see in this list are the strings that you're actually providing, which here are literal strings. They look like numbers, but they're actually strings. What you see in the list is the string. The value that would be chosen and used as the argument when you press enter is also the string. So if you were doing something where you wanted to provide actual arguments, for example, the name of branches, if you happen to be a command in Sublime Merge, which uses something along these lines, then you would use a list of strings. Sometimes, though, you may be more interested in something like this, where there's a value you want to use for the argument, but you want to prompt the user with a human readable string. An example of this that you might have encountered previously is in a web page, if you're a web developer, and it's a very common thing in a lot of user interfaces. In this option, you provide a list of tuples instead of a list of strings, and the first item in the tuple is the string that appears in the list for you to choose from, and the second one is the value that would be used for the argument, which here are actual numbers. And this is the one we've been seeing thus far. So instead of seeing 0, 50, -1, and -100, we actually get to see top of the file, middle of the file, bottom of the file, cancel here like so. So we see this text, but the value is that actual value that is the second item. And in all of the places we've covered here, for example, in the description method and in the preview method and in the validate method where it says value, this is why that's distinct. If you were using option one, the value would be that actual string. If you're using option two, then the value is the second item in the tuple. It's not the string that the user looked at to pick the item. It's the one you chose as the actual value, which could be different. Now, the last thing that we can do here, and we'll just very quickly comment that out, is this option here, which you would use if you wanted to display a list of items and also have one selected by default. The default selected item is the first one in the list. Now, when you do this, you provide a tuple where the first item is the list, and you can do that either of the previous two options. You could provide just a list of strings or a list of tuples. This particular example uses a list of tuples. The second item in this tuple is the number that is the index in that list of which item should be the selected one by default. That would be 0 by default. Here we've set it to 2, so this is item 0, this is item 1, this is item 2. When we run this with this code in place, after we save that up like so, and pick the item, the default item that is selected here is bottom of the file. It's item 2, which again, you could use if you remembered what the user chose last time, for example. You can do the same sort of thing by setting the initial text to set the filter. Setting an initial selected item in this way allows you to pick exactly what item while still showing all of them, which can also be handy as well. I'm just going to go ahead and comment this one back out and bring this one back in so we're ready for this last item, which here is next input, because there's a little bit of more nuance to this than we have covered up to now. Input handlers are actually implemented behind the scenes by way of a stack, and that stack starts off empty. The input method in the command class gets the first item on the stack, and every time an input handler has finalized and its confirm method is chosen and next input is called on that input handler, if that input handler returns another input handler, as this example does in both of these methods, then the new input handler is pushed onto the top of that stack, if you will, and that just continues on. Now, we've seen this in action, such as it is, because I choose this command, we see the command, we see this argument here, I choose the argument, now I'm at the next item. Each one of those little rounded bubbles there is, for lack of a better terminology, a stack item right here. If I push backspace right now, I'm inherently doing a pop of the top item on the stack. So now I'm back where I was before, entering the name for this, entering the text I want to insert. And if I enter some text, that is pushed onto the stack, and now there's a new item that is the next argument. And again, I can push backspace to pop that one off the stack. And as a matter of fact, currently I'm here entering that argument. I can pop one more time, and take myself right back to the command palette. And again, this is why in order for commands to appear with input handlers, they must appear in the command palette. Have I said that enough times? This has to happen right here. And this is the reason why, because of this little stack of items here. And because this is a stack of items, inherently, we have the ability to push new items onto the stack by returning returning an instance of some input handler of some sort in response to input in the command or next input in a command handler. It's possible to also pop from one of these as well, which you could potentially do depending on arguments that were chosen by the user. And in this contrived example, the confirm method here, as we've seen here, and I haven't mentioned this up to now, says that self.selectedValue equals value. So confirm is called when the user presses enter on one of those items and a validation says, yes, this is valid. The output is confirmed. The confirm method is called to tell the input handler the user has selected, this is the value they chose, or this is the text they chose, depending on which input handler you're inside of. We're saving that here. The next thing that happens after that is the next input method is called to say, we're done with this one. What other arguments do we need? Now, the code on lines 95 and 96 say, hey, if there's not a message in the list of the arguments, then we should use a message input handler, and that would be an inherent push of that item onto the stack so that we get to prompt for the next item. But what we have here is an item that says if self.selectedValue is -1, then return Sublime plugin.back input handler, and specifically an instance of it. Now we know we're saving the value the user chose, and we know that value -100 in this list is the one whose value associates with cancel, which is something that's been appearing in this list and we've been studiously avoiding up to now. But we can see in the preview there is inserting at position -100 because that's the value. And by choosing that item is popped off the list. We're back here and we could be typing more text in here if we wanted to. So that's one extra thing that we can do with this. You have the facility to move forward through more arguments to the command, and we also have the ability to go backwards through the list of items if we determine at this point, now that the user has entered this value, I realize that some of the other values they chose aren't correct. We're going to need to go back and ask for those things. That's a bit more of an advanced topic for something like this, but it is a very powerful facility indeed. As a recap of what we learned this lesson, when we define commands, we can also define input handlers for our commands, which, if they're in the command palette, allow us to prompt the user interactively for strings or selecting items from a list of items to really customize how our commands work. When we do that, we need to define classes that subclass from known base classes that are input handler types, and those base classes have methods inside of them that control how Sublime interacts with our input handlers, from things like what the default value should be or what the placeholder should be, all the way down to allowing us to validate whether or not the input is valid. We also have the ability to prompt for more arguments based on what we've seen before, or go backwards through a list of arguments to a different point if we need to prompt the user again. And of course, we can always add our own values in there as well. And with this, we have a real facility to add a lot of interactivity to some commands, which can really make life a whole lot easier. And that's all we've got for this particular topic. The next lesson in Plugin 101 is going to be event handler basics, where we're going to talk about ways of reacting to events that are happening instead of taking specific actions, which is what we've covered up to now. We may also venture forth into some example plugins that provide a little bit more background information on input handlers. So if that sounds interesting to you, do let me know in the comments section below. Other than that, you probably want to use those buttons down there to thumb, subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate. Ring the bell notification icon. YouTube will tell you when the next lesson becomes available. And when it does, I will be here. But until then, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.